Yeah, chapter 13, the lucky chapter, right? So here's where we start getting into the spinal cord, and I just want to kind of show you a picture of spinal cord. We'll cover looking at this also in terms of laboratory material. You can see there's some centralized gray material here surrounded by extensive white material. You see nerves that are projecting away from the spinal cord and into. There's a portion of the nerve here that is conveying all sensory information. All sensory information through from the peripheral nervous system is conducted into this posterior root or dorsal root. So all sensory information enters the spinal cord through the dorsal root. The motor part, all the motor part exits through the ventral root. Okay, very nice segregation of anatomy here, and they join together to form the spinal nerve. You'll see here there's a part of it called the dorsal root ganglion. We'll look at that in more detail this chapter than the dorsal root. The gray matter is divided up into the posterior gray horn, a little piece right here called the lateral gray horn, and then the anterior gray horn up here. We have the anterior median fissure. This quite a large division here between the two halves of the spinal cord, and then a thinner division called the posterior median sulcus. This little bit of gray matter right here in the center is called the posterior gray commissure. This opening is where we'll see cerebral spinal fluid flow, okay, called the central canal. And then just anterior to that is the anterior gray commissure. For the white matter, we have the posterior white matter, the lateral white matter, and the anterior white matter, and we'll cover those in a little more detail. The spinal cord is only around 18 inches. I know it must seem like it's a little longer than that, but truly that's all it is. It's not very wide. It ends in between the vertebrae known as lumbar 1 and 2 for most people. This is where it ceases at, and it does exhibit what's called bilateral symmetry. And this is the idea that there are similar components on both halves of the spinal cord. We have 31 pairs of spinal nerves, remember, and the first pair passes between the skull and cervical 1 vertebrae, and that would be known as the C1 nerve. So these are numbered pretty normally. There is a couple little weird areas in here, but we're not going to worry too much about the numbering of the nerves. I just want you to understand some of the conventions behind numbering them. They all pass then, once, except for this between the skull and the vertebrae, they'll all pass through that structure you learned in the bones called the intervertebral foramina. Remember the 4 sections of the spinal cord: the cervical, thoracic, lumbar, and sacral. There are some enlargements in the spinal cord, as you might expect, regions where nerve density would increase, and that would be in your arms, shoulders and arms, right? As well as your legs. So there will be enlargements in the gray matter in the cervical area. So there's the so-called cervical enlargement, and lower down for where the nerves exit for the legs, exit and enter for the legs, called the lumbar enlargement. At the distal end or inferior end of the spinal cord, we have a component called the conus medullaris, and we'll see a picture of that in just a second. The very tips or ends of the spinal cord called the filum terminale, and then the nerves that extend from the ending of the spinal cord almost look like a horsetail, and that's exactly what cauda equina translates to. So here are the spinal cord regions: the cervical, the neck region. The area opposite the chest is the thoracic region. We have the lumbar region, which is kind of where the S-curve is, right, where you get lumbar padding. And then the very distal sacral region, right? Just past the sacral region is the medullary cone. Right in this tip is going to be the terminal finale. And then you have the cauda equina, the nerves that are extending down through the sacrum and projecting potentially onto your legs. And so here we have the terminal phelum right there, right at the tip of where the conus medullaris is. All right, cauda equina. And so you see the lumbar enlargement, the cervical enlargement, they thin out again. So you see the nerves C1 through C7, T1 through T12, L1 through L5, S1 through S5. We can see how there are the spinal nerves as they emerge from the spinal cord and form the spinal nerves that will transmit information to the body and retrieve sensory information.